Thank you so much. Heritage starts with her, women writers writing back to Tolkien's Legendarium. In their excellent working paper, Heritage as Hyperobject, Nick Polk and Leah Hagen introduced the concept of the hyperobject, developed by Timothy Morton. This term, quote, is used to refer to things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. They point out that Tolkien's Legendarium is such a hyperobject. I would agree, although noting that the published Legendarium, voluminous as it is only part of a larger hyperobject, what I call the Tolkien phenomenon, which includes not only all the translations and adaptations of Tolkien's work, but also all the criticism, fan and scholarly. I plan to address a relatively small part of that hyperobject today, Tolkien's influence on three Anglophone women fantasy writers. One of the most significant aspects of an author's heritage is influence on the writers who follow them. There's been a tendency in scholarship and criticism to assume that white men are Tolkien's natural heirs, with Ursula K. Le Guin occasionally mentioned as the exceptional, aka token, woman. While the list of women fantasy writers influenced by Tolkien has expanded in recent years, Faye Ringel is the first and so far the only scholar I know of who analyzes how Tolkien's work has influenced women writers. In her 2000 essay, Women Fantasists in the Shadow of the Ring, Ringel interviews four white Anglophone female fantasy authors, Patricia McKillop, Delia Sherman, Greer Eileen Gilman, and Rosemary Edgell, all of whom are roughly part of the same generation, born between 1948 and 56, so part of the baby boom. This generation was the first generation of fantasy writers to grow up in the shadow of Tolkien's Legendarium, who went on to create the larger genre of fantasy. Ringel draws on Harold Bloom's The Anxiety of Influence to make the feminist argument that while the writers acknowledge, quote, their debt to Tolkien's authentic secondary world, the inevitability of his plot, the magic of his words, the languages and history of Middle-earth, they also declare their uneasiness with certain of what they see as Tolkien's premises, and so reject his unquestioned acceptance of medieval ideals of kingship and class structure and his portrayal of women's roles, end of quote. As a result, their writing choices work against the Tolkienian grain in ways that Ringel argues fits Bloom's definition of the swerve. She, of course, is making her own swerve to take his theory to apply to women writing fantasy. Bloom himself was most concerned with developing a theory about how male poets who create poetic misreadings of the influencing male poet, who mostly seems to be Shakespeare. Given the nearly 70 years since The Fellowship of the Ring was published, I think it may be useful to start considering writers from later generations. The writers I discussed today were born between 1972 and the mid-1980s, so Gen X. I explore how Victoria Goddard's The Bone Harp, Katherine Addison's The Goblin Emperor, and N.K. Jemisin's The Broken Earth trilogy create a range of strong misreadings of the spiritual and racial hierarchies of Tolkien's Elves and Orcs by swerving from or writing back to Tolkien's Legendarium. Dallas John Baker defines the concept of writing back as a progressive, even radical literary strategy used by, quote, feminist, post-colonial, and queer writers to reclaim, reimagine, and complicate normative or marginalizing narratives that are colonial or widely disseminated, end of quote. The larger project of which this presentation is a part will develop a more extended comparative argument about the similarities and differences between the three writers' works as a body, not just individual ones, and their responses to Tolkien. Today, I'm going to briefly outline some of what they've said about their work and identify some of the most significant world building and characterization swerves they make. Victoria Goddard has a doctorate in medieval studies and lists J.R.R. Tolkien as one of her favorite authors. The Bone Harp, A Tale of Elfland, which is a standalone novel, is a transformative and mythopoetic reworking of the Feanorian story. An elven father and his 7 sons swear an oath to eternal night to retrieve the flame imperishable which came from the gods. That flame was stolen by the old enemy, who also broke the lamps that provide light to the world. The brothers' oath results in all but one of them, Tamsin, dying. He cannot die because of the interaction between the oath and the death curses of the great dragon and the old enemy whom he killed, while failing to recover the flame imperishable. Goddard's Elflands is similar to Arda in some of its cosmological and thematic elements. The lamps, the later creation of the sun and moon, music as a powerful creative force, and the immortality of the elves, who may be killed, in war especially, but who go to the halls of rest with the choice of later returning to life. The elves have to leave their homeland, Elflands, to go to the land over the sea, capital S, to retrieve the flame from the monstrous allies or creations of the old enemy, goblins, trolls, ghouls, dragons, and all the other monsters. However, Goddard's world building and characterization of the elves swerves in major ways from Tolkien's. The female characters are more numerous throughout, and several major point of view characters are women. Clara, a co-protagonist and point of view character, is Tamsin's lifelong best friend, fellow musician, friendly rival, and lover. Tamsin's mother, Alina, still lives and joins with Clara to play a significant part in bringing Tamsin home. 2 young elf maidens, River and Ash, befriend Tamsin after he wakes alone in the Elflands, centuries after the war ends, without knowing who he is, and bring him with them to the old city. The history of what happens in the Elflands, while the long war is going on overseas to regain the flame, is told primarily through Tamsin's and Clara's memories, narrated in a series of flashbacks. The first section of the novel, West of the River, opens with Tamsin waking up, physically healed, back in the Elflands, but amnesiac and traumatized. The quest in his novel is traveling to the old city and healing over that time as he goes with River and Ash. The climax of the section, however, is the 2 final chapters which describe the crossing of the Bridge of the Dead. All travelers in the Elflands who travel from the west to the east must confront all of their dead. Tamsin faces not only the thousands he killed in the war, including the goblins and monsters, but also other elves, as well as all the other living beings he has caused the deaths of, insects, the animals and fish he killed and ate throughout his entire long elvish life. In those chapters, the deathless elf must face the realities of the deaths he caused. He is able to complete this journey across the bridge in part because of River and Ash helping him. In the second section, the Old City, Clara remembers the events leading up to the original oath, quote, to cast down the old enemy and regain the fire or be damned into the eternal night, although she refused, as did many other elves, to take that oath, as well as the millennia after the war was fought and after it ended, with the flame imperishable finally returning to the Elflands. But Tamsin did not realize the role that Clara played in retrieving the flame. In the third and final section, Fair Elflands, Tamsin and his companions have completed their journey to the Old City, and he reunites with his 7 brothers who returned from the Hall of Rest, his mother, and Clara. Katherine Addison criticizes genre fantasy's reliance on quests and coming-of-age stories, as well as on the limited roles for female characters. She points out Tolkien's, quote, pastoral nostalgia, his ingrained racism, and his equally ingrained adherence to a utopian version of the class structure of pre-World War I England. She explained how she got the idea for the Goblin Emperor in an interview in Steampunk Journal. Quote, well, it was when the Lord of the Rings movies were coming out, and I was thinking about elves and the very tall, very pale, very beautiful people, and thinking it seems very unfair to goblins that they always have to be sort of dark and slimy and unpleasant. What if goblins too were a noble people? End of quote. The Goblin Emperor does a strong misreading of the missing heir trope, where the son of a king is raised in isolation, then suddenly comes to power. The storyline focuses on Maya, who is the mixed-race son of the Elven Emperor and his fourth wife, a Goblin princess. Yes, his name is the same as the singular form of the Maiar, Tolkien spirits who accompany the Valar to Arda. Maya is exiled from court as an infant, along with his mother, and raised in isolation after she dies. He becomes emperor of the Elflands only after his father and the first three sons die in an airship disaster. A tight third-person point of view limited to Maya immerses readers in his experiences of going from a half-breed abused exile to emperor of the Elflands, facing the distrust of the elven nobility at court because of their racism against goblins, and his struggle to learn enough to be able to rule justly. Addison creates two empires, one ruled by elves, one ruled by goblins, which share a border. These competing empires are modeled on later historical periods than Tolkien's early medieval world. In the cities, they are moving into the early stages of industrialism, airships and growing factories. There is growing trade between the empires, leading to the development of a middle class who exist in the cities and outside the nobles' estates, where the nobility serf class structure still exists. There are different systems of imperial governance, complicated by a third nomadic culture in the north that has been locked in a multi-generational guerrilla resistance to elvish imperialism. And polytheism is institutionalized in a network of different churches and priesthoods, some of whom have spiritual powers that I hesitate to call magic, since that term is never used in the novel. Religion in Addison's novel is foundational in the sense of the institutional elements of a religion which serves multiple gods, practices multiple rituals and prayers, and has competing priesthoods who have a history of involvement in the political maneuverings of empires. Racial hierarchies and prejudices exist, but while the elves look down on the goblins, with their own empire, equally look down on the elves. While the centers of power in both empires are elven or goblin dominated, by the present of the novel, there has been a long history of interactions along the borders and in newly built settlements and towns that include trade and intermarriage between elves and goblins, and thus contribute to the growing number of mixed-race characters at all social levels, now with Maya's ascension, including the emperor. The effects of these movements and mingling of populations are, if judged by the current historical scholarship on the history of people of color in medieval and pre-modern Europe, probably more, quote, accurate historically than Tolkien's world, with its isolated strongholds and xenophobic peoples. Maya becoming emperor undercuts some of the nobility's elven isolationism and classism, and he begins to establish a foundation for systemic changes that will improve the lives of those who are not part of the hereditary nobility, as well as the relationship between the two empires. N.K. Jemisin knows Tolkien's work well. She describes her lifelong love for science fiction and fantasy that her father shared with her. But when she began writing fantasy, she began to question the whiteness of epic fantasy, wondering if, quote, paying so much attention to the power fantasies of disenchanted white men was a betrayal of her own realities as an African-American woman. In Tolkien's work, she saw a man, quote, trying desperately to dream, end of quote, which Jemisin values. But, as she notes, dreaming requires myths. And if people, quote, don't have enough myths of our own, we'll latch onto those of others, even if those myths make us believe terrible or false things about ourselves, end of quote. Tolkien's description of his cauldron of story is one full of tales of Northwestern Europe that were important to him, tales that primarily focus on heroes, princes, gods, and kings. Jemisin shares Tolkien's love for mythologies and histories, but she had to seek out the stories of her family, her ancestors, and world epics outside those of England and Europe in order to create the Broken Earth trilogy. Her quest led her to, quote, plenty of epics which feature people like me. Sundiata's badass mother, Diha, warrior queen of the Amazons, the Rain Queens, the Minor Warriors, Hatshepsut's reign, everything Harriet Tubman ever did, and more, so much more, just within the African components of my heritage, end of quote. In her Broken Earth trilogy, which won 3 Hugos, one for each novel, Jemisin writes back to Tolkien's Legendarium, to the genre of epic fantasy his work inspired, and the faux universality of what is, in fact, only one of many global mythologies. One element Jemisin subverts is Tolkien's Elves. Her long-lived mythological beings are the stone eaters, who are made of living rock rather than flesh, long-lived but not indestructible. They were able to move through stone by phasing or fusing with it, as well as through air. And their origins are a mystery that is solved only near the end of the trilogy. They are aware that the planet, known by all as Father Earth, which is of course a major twist in itself, is sentient and trying to destroy all surface life in revenge for actions taken millennia ago that affected the moon, Father Earth's child. Although the human characters have stories of Father Earth and know his destructiveness well, none of them know that history behind the stories, or that the war between Father Earth and the people living on his surface has lasted over 40,000 years. Jemisin's series breaks the binary of the racist hierarchy of superior white people who enslave the inferior Black and brown people. In this world, the origins are those who are enslaved, but not because of their skin color or because their land was invaded by colonizers, although the Sanzet Empire was a colonizing power, but because the origins have the genetic ability to manipulate rock. Their name derives from our geological term, orogeny, which means, quote, a process in which a section of the Earth's crust is folded and deformed by lateral compression to form a mountain range, end of quote. The Sanzet Empire initiated a millennia-long system of slavery in order to use the origins to control, to some extent, the earthquakes and volcanic eruptions that Father Earth creates on a regular basis, which allowed their empire to last longer than the earlier ones. The novel opens with one of the origins breaking the tectonic plate in which the world's supercontinent is embedded, which will lead over time to a complete destruction of all life on the planet. The novel's plot centers around 2 journeys. The first, that of a mother, Essun, an origin who escaped slavery to save her daughter, who was stolen from her. The second journey is Nasun's, the daughter, who was taken by her father after he killed her young brother when he manifested his orogeny. Nasun has learned to hide her power from her father, but eventually has to save a guardian and then kill her father in order to survive to adulthood and to learn how to use her orogeny more powerfully. When Essun and Nasun come together at the end, they are able to resolve their conflicts and work together to save the world, as well as end the millennia-long system of slavery. Jemisin asserts the right of everyone to dream and to create futures from those dreams, as well as to create new mythologies. Quote, we all have futures, we all have pasts, we all have stories, and we all, every single one of us, no matter who we are, and no matter what's been taken from us or what poison we've internalized or how hard we've had to work to expel it, we all get to dream, end of quote. Goddard, Addison, and Jemisin, along with many others, are part of the hyper-object of Tolkien's heritage, although I suspect that how they have responded to his work is beyond anything he could imagine. But that is the nature of a hyper-object. They are the mythopoeic writers who will help more of us dream. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Robin, for talking to us and providing a different approach to the idea of heritage and how we can actually write back, question, and how that actually kind of becomes a part of how heritage builds and manifests differently. as time moves on. So just a reminder to everyone, if you do have any questions, then please do use our Q&A function as well for our authors. It was really interesting, Robin, where you were talking about like one of the key things I think that stood out to me before you mentioned the mum and the daughter, Essen and
Nasun.
Essen and
Yeah.
Nasun, were how you kind of have that kind of father and or not necessarily a father, but kind of like the older male and the younger male figure, like repetitively in Tolkien. Like just think about Bilbo and Frodo, for instance, but then there's Gandalf and Frodo, Gandalf and Bilbo. It just seems to be quite a strong duo that happens, and then you've got this consistent change as well that seems to be going on. I wonder, like, could you maybe like probe into that a little bit more about like the implications more broadly, perhaps, around providing a mother and a daughter as the nexus of the story?
It's something I've been fascinated for a long time. In 1993, I did a presentation on Sherry Tepper's Grass, which I called an epic feminist revision of Dune, which again has as the quest a mother's search to rescue her daughter. And there aren't that many quests of mothers and daughters in fantasy that I'm aware of. There are some, and if you all know ones that I don't know, please get in touch with me and send them to me. So yes, Jemisin's work, in fact, most of Jemisin's fantasy, although one of her earlier works, she said she started working with a man and a sort of a male teacher, younger student, as I recall. But she soon realized she needed to explore what women, and especially Black women, are doing. And what we're talking about here, of course, is a major shift because of, as she points out, the whiteness of epic fantasy. And so it's white men that are doing it. There are also a number of fantasy authors. I don't deal with them because it's not my area, but Black and Indigenous and men of color who are exploring fantasy, drawing from their cultures and their dreams. So yeah, so much of the power of the Broken Earth trilogy and some of her other work is to do with the women. I'm not sure if that helps, but yes, it's a very interesting issue. And like I said, the reframing of the quest for it. But I mean, Elflands, which is a standalone novel, and actually a lot of Victoria Goddard's other stuff. She has a huge nine world series that I couldn't squeeze in here, but I'll bring in later. The quest in that is simply a wounded and traumatized male hero who has fought and killed for millennia, learning to inhabit the world again without killing people and healing and going back. And I mean, I love the Bone Harp so much because it's an absolute revision of the Fëanorian story, including his mother being alive and actually being actively involved in his rescue. So I'm sort of like neener for Victoria Goddard on that.
Yeah, and a couple of people did notice as well the parallels between the text and the Fëanorian traditions. Like, wait, this seems like the Silmarillion. It's like, there we go.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I wonder as well, like, so you were just asking about suggestions about Marlon James's Moon Witch and Spider King, which is I quite enjoyed it, but it might be one that you might consider in your studies.
I actually think I've heard of that, so thank you so much. Moon Witch and Spider Queen.
Spider King by Marlon
Spider
James.
King, sorry.
I'll put it in the chat as well for you.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions by any of our audience members? I'll just give you a second if you're typing one out.
I suspect many people, just because of my experience before, may not have read Goddard, and she is an independent author, but I can so highly recommend not only Bone Harp, but her entire Nine World series. And Addison's novel is also, it's technically a trilogy, but not, I mean, it's 3 books, but it's not really. The character in the next 2 books in the Oreth series is one of the fairly important but minor characters in terms of narrative space, who is a gay male elf and a priest in one of their religions. So I can highly highly recommend that.